I don't know, but it sounds reasonable. And the other reason dinosaurs are not mentioned is they're not important. They're just rocks. They're not around. They're not a threat. They're no food. They're just fossils. Creation. What this chart illustrates is that there's he has a process that works, and he does not abandon it. He keeps using it. Now, in the creation story, it says, the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. So, one way to interpret the dust is that it is literal. God actually took dust, a saw, and transformed that into a human body. Others say, no, that just indicates that man developed through evolution like other things did. It's not important that we know how God did all this. If you're a scientist studying in this field, yes, you want to know. You want to research the evidence and treat it fairly. But to most of us, it does not matter. What matters is that we know who created. Now, in Genesis 1:27, it says, let us make a saw, that's transform, something that already exists, the dust, into our image. And then it says, so God bara, created out of nothing, man in his own image, in the image of God, he created, bara, him, male and female, he created them. So, with humanity, the Bible uses both a saw to transform something that already exists, and bara to make something that did not exist out of God himself. And what that something is that did not exist is called the image of God. It's not physical. God is spirit. Dr. Huang has said many times, God is eternal, immaterial, and transcendent. God is the first cause of space, time, energy, matter, and life. Life is not an accident. The image of God refers to human exceptionalism. That is, what makes humanity different from any other animal. The ability to appreciate beauty, justice, and truth. There is no evidence that any animals, even the most intelligent chimpanzee, has any appreciation of beauty. The ability to reason, communicate, and show agape love. Agape love is godlike love. It cares more about the person it helps than it does itself. And then this image of God attempts to seek meaning in life. If we are accidents, what about survival of the fittest? Does pursuing meaning in life, what does that accomplish? It does nothing to preserve our genetic pool. Why? Why do we care about meaning? Even people that do not believe in God care about meaning. those who do not commit suicide eventually. So why do we have this need for meaning in life? I think it's because we're created in the image of God, and there's a hole. There's a hole in our spirit that only God can fill. And that soul is present at our birth, present now, and present in the future, even after we die. The right way to think of humanity is not with bodies that have souls. It's what they are souls who have bodies. Darwin's life by accident theory has some big scientific problems. We've already looked at the Cambrian explosion and the lack of transitional fossils, but it also fails to explain the origin of first life. The quote here is from Sir Fred Hoyle, who was an astronomer, astrophysicist, and atheist. He says, the notion that DNA, the biopolymer and the operating program of a living cell, could be arrived at by chance in a primordial organic soup here on Earth is evidently nonsense of a high order. He said there's not enough time. Earth is too young for that to have happened here. So what does he think happened? He thinks life developed somewhere else in the universe and was transported here by asteroids. We'll talk about that more in a minute. There is something called abiogenesis theory. What that means is that inorganic chemicals came together somehow to form organic chemicals, which somehow came together to form proteins, which somehow organized to produce a living cell. There's a famous experiment called Miller-Urey experiment that took place in the early 50s, where they put ammonia, water vapor, and an electric spark in the test tube. And the electric spark was to represent lightning. And from that, they produced a few simple amino acids. But no scientist today, even though that's still in textbooks, no scientist today gives any credence to that experiment because he used the wrong atmosphere. The atmosphere did not contain ammonia. It contained CO2, some nitrogen, and a little oxygen. And they've tried to repeat those experiments using that right atmosphere, and they get nothing. And even if you could produce those proteins, there is no self-organizing principle that causes them to form into a living cell that has 23 separate components, all of which are required for that cell to survive and reproduce. So there's no supporting evidence that life can begin from inorganic chemicals on its own. So without life, without God, how could life begin? Here's what Fred Hoyle said. If there was some deep principle that drove our organic chemical systems toward living systems, you should be able to demonstrate that in a test tube in half a day. No such demonstration has ever been given. Nothing happens except production of a tarry sludge, dirt, nothing. Fred Hoyle said he was a proponent of the theory of panspermia. But what this relies on is that the universe is a very old steady state universe. In other words, it's multiple hundreds of billions of years old. But it's only 13.7 billion years old, and that's not enough time. So when he came up with this theory, he thought the universe was in a steady state condition. We know from scientific evidence that it began 13.7 billion years ago and is still expanding. That's not enough time for life to have developed by accident. And then finally, the third problem is something called irreducible biological complexity. And the example I use is the old television sets when you had tubes in them before integrated circuits. You could take a television set and remove it from the cabinet. So you've taken one component away from it, but it still works. You can take the knobs off of the controls. It still works. But at some point, you're going to take something out of that TV system, and it will either have no picture or no sound, or the picture will fluctuate. Something will not work. Well, that thing that you just took out was part of the irreducibly complex TV system. And the point of this is, how do you get something that requires all of its components to work by gradually assembling the components? How does that happen in nature? It doesn't. It requires intelligence to do that. So when you apply that to a cell, how could a cell evolve gradually? It couldn't. For example, a cell's got to have a DNA to reproduce. And the DNA has to be in the cell to survive. Now, in laboratories, human intelligence can do all kinds of tricks. But that's not nature. It's not ruled by accidents in the laboratory. It's ruled by human intelligence doing things. So what can be done in the laboratory is not representative of what can be done in nature. Another way to look at that is to say human intelligence in the laboratory is trying to replicate the intelligence of God who created in the first place. So, some observations. Life by accident theory has serious flaws. God both directly created and guided evolution. How much of each, we can't be sure, and it's not important that we know. But we must know that God created all things, including us, in His image. We are spirits like God is, clothed in a physical body. How doesn't matter. Who matters very much. Now, in 2024, I wanted to find out how many famous scientists were Christians throughout history. And these are the numbers that I found from Wikipedia. And here's one I want to quote. He's living now. This man, Michael Gillian, has a PhD in theoretical physics, mathematics, and astronomy. 3 PhD. He says, I have a worldview broad enough to accommodate the scientific method and the Bible, reason and faith, the universe and God. He doesn't say it has to be science because God doesn't exist. He says God exists. In fact, he says science is not the enemy of God. It is God's gift to humanity, a brilliant way to explore his transfinite nature and stunning creation. Another name that you may know, also still living, Michael Collins. He is a medical doctor, has a PhD in chemistry from Yale, was former director of the National Human Genome Research Institute and former director of the National Institute of Health. When he was a graduate student, he was an atheist. But he had an encounter one day with a seriously ill patient. It was a patient he was caring for. And that patient was dealing with his serious health problems with peace and joy that Francis Collins couldn't understand. Why are you at peace? Why do you have joy? And the person told him, because God is real. I know him, and he will take care of me. Whether I live or whether I die, he will take care of me. This Francis Collins said, with respect to the Human Genome Project, the God of the Bible is also God of the genome. His creation is majestic, awesome, intricate, and beautiful. God is not threatened by science. He made it possible. There's really no conflict between science and the Bible, unless one is determined to create conflict. As I've shown before, the two extremes are wrong. The truth is somewhere in the middle. Where exactly? I don't know. Dr. Huang doesn't know, and it doesn't matter. We can disagree on the location of how much God used direct creation and evolution, but we do not disagree on who did it. We know God did it. Dr. Huang.
我们谢谢 Newton 给我们这么详细的解答哈我呢没有其他要加入的，我觉得说很详细解答很好，但是呢我更喜欢用简单的我自己怎么看法我讲给你们听看看。然后呢我现在就先问一下